few seconds. Okay, there we go. And I'm gonna go, whoops, no, full screen. There we go. Okay, so this will mainly be a Q&A session, so I don't want to talk for very long, but I will start briefly by giving a bit of background, and then we can go from there. I'm gonna talk for just like 5 minutes. So as a reminder, what is Unity? Unity is it's essentially a CI step that we use to test Q changes to the Q language and tooling, and it tests third-party projects with those changes, right? So it ensures that those third-party projects do not break unexpectedly for those projects that are part of Unity. And it also is useful to us to find bugs and regressions in Q before we actually release those out as part of an alpha, beta, or even stable release, right? So it's just, for the project, it's mainly a CI step. You can think of it as like an addition to the regular tests that we have. The previous Unity setup, which was a public repo under the QUnity org, had projects added to it via pull requests as Git submodules. So you would come in and you would have maybe, for example, a project like kubevela, which is open source as well. You would add a Git submodule link, and you would give a command to run to test the project, and that was pretty much it with a Git submodule. There were some major drawbacks with the system. The most important one is that it didn't support private projects. So because everything was out in the open and Git submodules, you can't have a Git submodule from a public repo to a private one, right? That doesn't really work. And we already had the case that quite a few important Q users didn't have public projects. Their Q code was private, so this was a blocker for us being able to expand the testing corpus. The submodule links are also kind of brittle. So if the target repo vanishes, or maybe the history is rewritten in terms of Git commits, you could have issues like, for example, CI stops working because the Git can no longer clone the target of the submodule link. And you could also not test multiple major versions of Q at a single time, because if the behavior of Q changes too much, the quote-unquote golden files, or what you expect, the exact way in which you expect Q to behave, could change between major versions, right? And because we use Unity as CI, and we want to be able to, for example, do a bug fix release for 0.5 and work on 0.6 alphas at the same time, we need to be able to have, you could say, multiple branches of these golden files. But the old Unity setup had like a single set of golden files in master. So that was a bit of a limitation as well, especially when dealing with backporting fixes and so on. The new Unity setup, it's mainly a GitHub app that you can install. And when you install it, you share your code with us. And then the latest version of your project gets automatically added to the Unity corpus, as in the body of Q code. And this is automatic with the Unity app. It is still integrated with CI, just like the previous setup. And it's a little bit different in that when you install the app, we don't just store a pointer to your code. You share your code with us. So it's not brittle in the ways that the previous setup was. And it also supports private code because of this. So all three design issues with the previous setup are gone pretty much. I will repeat that there's multiple avenues for any of you to get in touch with me, because I'm the one driving Unity at the moment. You can email unity@qlabs.dev. You can Slack DM me. I've also got a cal.com link that you can use to set up a 1 hour, well, up to 1 hour one-on-one video call if you want to discuss any questions or any issues adding your project, or maybe you don't know how to add your project because it's a little bit more complicated or different. Please get in touch. I also created a Unity Slack channel in the public in the public Slack workspace. So that's a nice public place to talk about it. And we've also got an announcements discussion 24/7, which is useful as you can think of it as a broadcast or newsletter. So you can subscribe to it. It's a locked thread, but any updates, say about once a week, or maybe once every 2 weeks, we'll post comments there, and you can just see that as a bit of a news item. So onto the Q&A. You can either raise your hand and ask questions in using your voice, or you can leave questions as comments on the chat. Or I believe there's also a Q&A feature under the little triangle and square UI at the bottom right. Any of those forms sound good. And we do have a few submitted questions ahead of time. So One of them is why only GitHub? So that is a good question, but it's mainly a matter of prioritization, if I can say that word, prioritization. Basically, a lot of projects are already on GitHub, so focusing on that first makes sense, but that's just the first step, right? A GitHub app, just like an app on GitLab or anywhere else, gives us an easy authorization flow out of the box. So you install the app, you grant access to your code to the app, if I said that correctly. So basically, there's nothing for us to set up as an extra step in terms of auth. So that's easy. And we can and likely will consider doing a GitLab app next, just because GitLab.com is like most easily the second largest code hosting website. And once we have our own proper auth system or something like it, you can. It's likely that we're also going to do something a bit more bare bones, like, for example, an authenticated HTTP post endpoint for you to upload zips. Because what the GitHub app does essentially is take your source code, make it into a zip archive, and then upload it to us. So that's pretty much the same thing, minus the automatic authentication. And that is pretty much it for me. I will go back to all of you to see if any of you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll just keep going off of my prepared questions. Or not just questions. If any of you have any ideas or anything else, I'm also happy to talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious. Will the Unity CLI remain as it is now?
What do you mean by Unity CLI, to be clear?
The binary that's in the Unity in the CMD directory.
You mean this? So QUnity / Unity?
Yeah.
So I've actually only just deprecated, and I'm
Okay.
about to archive this repo. There's multiple reasons why this is happening. The main one is, like I explained in this slide, is that this method has a bunch of drawbacks. But it's also a matter of design and scaling for us as in terms of CI, because this system is essentially meant to test all the projects sequentially and locally, and that is already not scaling well enough, right? We have about 12 projects, and it takes between 5 and 10 minutes to test all of them. So in these ways, but also others, the current system wasn't working. It was just limiting us.
Can I ask why you asked the question? Because that was quite a specific question, almost like There's a reason why you're using the CLI.
Yeah. So the reason is basically because I precisely tried to or prepared a PR in one of our projects to set up ready for Unity. And I might be missing some important information, but if I recall correctly, I followed one of the examples and I copied one step for GitHub Actions that basically installs the Unity CLI and runs Unity test over the as a step. So I was curious if that, even if maybe that's not even correct, and if that's correct, yeah.
You're absolutely right. So that, Daniel, and you can just jump in here. So I'll give a first part of the answer, because I have to put my hands up and say that I was the person who wrote the original Unity code. So as bad as it is, you can direct all of those complaints at me, and Daniel has. So that's totally fine. I'll take that on my shoulders. That is a mode in which Unity used to run, and this is actually it's a very good question, because it sort of leads into, okay, well, and Daniel hinted at it in his earlier slide as to where we're going with this. The way that having someone have to install Unity as a GitHub action is fine. But sort of better is to have the Unity app itself integrated with your repository, such that in the future, when, for example, you create a PR or there's a new commit, the app does something such that it triggers an event and says, oh, new PR. And then we could integrate it automatically, such so then having status checks automatically coming into the PR. rather than you having to explicitly change your workflow in any way, shape, or form. So right now, what you have to do is have to add it as a step in your workflow and say, oh, now run Unity manually. And as Daniel said, what also becomes quite tricky in that situation is that the golden files are either source of truth, for want of a better phrase, of whether this configuration passes or not. That is quite a bit more dynamic when there are different queue versions involved, but also when you're changing configuration on your side. So actually, it's quite a bit more complicated, although possible, to try and do things in your workflow. So instead, what we're going to be moving towards is a model whereby you effectively push the responsibility for running Unity entirely onto us, and then we can report back with results for you in much the same way. Like I'm trying to think of a very good example of an app that adds status checks. I can only think of Netlify as a very good one, but that's not it's not a very good close analogy for what we're doing here. Is if you have a repository on GitHub that has the Netlify app installed, as you create a PR, it automatically triggers stuff to happen within Netlify. Netlify then reports back to the PR saying, oh, I've deployed a preview for you, etc. So much the same way, that's where we're going to be heading with Unity as well.
Great, nice, yeah, thanks.
I think another example, if any of you were around back in the day, is Travis, before we had GitHub Actions. So you would install Travis as an app because Action is embedded in GitHub, right? But Travis was a separate app you had to install and authorize. And then whenever you raised a PR or made a change, it would report back. So Unity will be quite similar when it gains this functionality. And to some degree, we could have done some of this by you running Unity yourself. But beyond that being more difficult for you, it's also more limited. So for example, things like we want to tag a new queue release, right? So before we tag the release, we want to make sure that none of the projects are being broken by this release that we're about to do, because if that were the case, it would be bad, right? We want to know. But if people run Unity in a fully distributed way, without, to put it in a way, us being in the middle of it, it's impossible for us to double check with all the projects, right? So that is the trade-off at play.
Yeah, thanks.
I will just say that if you still find yourself needing/wanting to run the CLI, and there's something that you want to do that we haven't covered today, please let us know, because we don't want to miss something, as it were. But exactly what Daniel said is where we're heading. So
yeah, I'll do. But so far, sounds good.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks.
I see a couple of people just joined. So FYI, we went through a few slides to just give a bit of background on Unity. And I explained the differences between the old and new system. And now we've got the floor open to questions if any of the new people have any questions or ideas or input.
So you talk about all the new. Is new fully operational now, or is still in transition?
Yes, it's fully operational. In terms of CI, so if you look at any changes or CLs that are currently in flight, it looks the same, because we just essentially try to mimic. You could think of it as we change the backend, but not the front end, right? One thing at a time. But yes, it's finished. And that's in fact why I'm now looking at archiving the old repo, just to make sure that nobody gets confused as to what is currently being used.
So what are the steps for project to join Unity? Well, my understanding is I should register with the Unity app. I didn't try to do this, but because, well, we would like to know more about it. And I would say I ask something else. Is there a rundown somewhere, a summary of how would the new project go about it, or authors of the project joining or onboarding?
Yeah, that's a good question. The brief answer is that it's a bit manual at the moment, just because we want to get experience adding you could say a couple dozen projects before we try to automate in any single direction. Because as one example, I initially thought that people would use Go Test to test their Q projects, but we're finding that some projects are using Go Run instead. So that's kind of the experience that we're gaining right now. So today, to add your project to Unity, it's number one, installing the app. You can do this either before or after talking with me. And step number 2, or if you want to do it the other way around, is essentially talking to me. So you can either book a time with me with that cal.com link that I shared here. You can email me, you can Slack DM me, but effectively it's you getting in touch with me and saying, hey, I would like to install Unity, or hey, I've just installed the app. And then we coordinate about things like exactly how to test your project that it still works, right? Because for some projects, that's going to be make test that maybe runs the Q command lines. For some other project, it's going to be go test. For some other projects, it's going to be go run, and so on. So it's effectively right now a bit of a back and forth with me to figure it out.
Will it also always go through GitHub Actions, or not necessarily, or is that independent question?
So right now, when you install the app, effectively what happens is that you give the app access to your repo, read-only access to your repo, meaning the contents, the Git contents, and nothing else. So with that, then you start sharing the code with us, and then we can run a command that we agree on. Like I said, go test some Q CLI command or something like that, and that is what gets run as part of CI on our side. So there isn't any GitHub Actions per se, at least not that is visible or that you should worry about.
Okay, so basically you're saying your environment runs the tests under tools
Correct.
that we agree upon and kind of come up with together. Okay. But the simplest to say just run go test, is that oversimplifying? At the minimum, just if there is a go test or with a test that responds to go test, running them, that would be start.
Yeah, for example.
On a minimum, or on example, at least.
It will depend on each project, but if your project has something like that, that would be a good starting point indeed. Yeah.
Just to quickly jump in on that one point there, because Go tests is obviously only relevant for someone who's using the Go API. If someone just has Q files, or even if they have Q files and they're using the Go API, what we're also working to try and do is come up with, I don't know what type of command to try and call it, but a command that can be run from the command Q CLI that evaluates everything in some way, shape, or form. Now, I waved my hands there deliberately because there is, if you just imagine a very large directory structure of Q files, you want to, yes, a better form of qeval /... that basically says, I'm going to try and load all Q files and do something sensible with each of them. That doesn't mean try and load everything as one big configuration graph. It will understand the structure of things on disk. It will understand that some things are necessarily incomplete. It will understand that some things are command specifications, and just try to do something, I use the word useful, in such a way that we can exercise the evaluator as far as possible without trying to do everything. So some things won't be able to be concrete, for example. So we can't just say Q export everything, because it might be deliberately incomplete within Q files. So as we are gathering code into the corpus, as Daniel said, we're trying to understand, well, what commands should we run? We are in parallel trying to work out, is there a command that we can run in all situations that will give us a high degree of confidence that if we were to run that command and check that nothing breaks, that we haven't broken that user, independent of how they actually use Q. So that would be an incredibly powerful thing if we could do that, because what that would give us is some metric of correctness and some metric of performance. Not perfect. And that's why I think in some situations we will need specific commands to help ensure that we are doing things correctly and from a performance perspective. For example, if you rely on exporting data to YAML, we have to exercise that by some stretch, right, to ensure that we haven't broken you in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, just to chuck that into the mix as well.
And I actually think that the tooling layer is a good example, because if your project has a command like this, Q command foobar, running that as part of Unity is probably not a same default, because the command could do anything it wants. It could sleep for an hour. It could try to remove the whole disk, right? I'm not saying that that's realistic, but queue evaluation in general is safe. But if you run a tool, a command, it can run whatever it wants. It's Turing complete. But if we had something that just evaluates the command in some way to show the way it would behave or what it would do if it was evaluated, if it was executed, sorry, that would be useful as a default, right? So that is the distinction. Go for it, Kevin.
All right. So I am one of those people who uses the CLI. So exactly what you're talking about, all that would definitely fit my use case. So for me, most of my questions, and I mentioned this on Slack, are around like the testing apparatus and how we define things in Q to support that testing. So I don't want to hijack this meeting. You know, if anyone else has questions, go first, because otherwise I'll bring up some of those ideas, but that could be a separate session. I just wanted to chime in. I see what you're saying about the tool evaluator, so it'd be great to see the output of what the tool is going to execute and be able to reify that in some other like Q or JSON structure that we could investigate as well would also suit that purpose.
I'm sure that Paul has a good answer to that, and I'm sure that he's got a better idea of the long-term plans for that. I think something I'm keeping in mind in terms of Unity for the near-term priorities is that having something like a Q test, whatever that could do, would be extremely useful for Unity. But it's not really my, how should I put that? I'm not focusing on that right now, just because I have plenty of work to, you could say, unblock releases like 0.7 and 0.8, making sure that they have a large enough corpus and that the CI system, you could say, works well enough. And then when we have all of those things, maybe I'll move on to looking at something like a Q test, or maybe somebody else will have picked it up by then. But I see them as two pieces of work that would benefit greatly from each other, but they're not necessarily a single piece, right?
For sure, and this is like a very important step, so awesome work, and thank you.
Did you have anything to add, Paul, before we move on to the next question?
No, I think you covered it perfectly there. And Kevin, I think you're holding it exactly right in terms of either Q test or that Uber command, if I can call it, that does something useful. I think Q test does, it picks up on exactly the point that I was hinting at, that in some situations you need and want it to do something specific, and Q test is more that thing, probably, right? And I think as we make progress with the corpus and adding things to the corpus, what would be very useful is, as Daniel said, establishing what commands people run and we agree on as being the contract, for a better phrase, will help to shape exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about there. So let's be honest, a number of people might actually be using makefiles for now for reasons, right? It's something they're more familiar with. Might just be that the tooling layer in its current version, which again was like a very initial version, it isn't up to scratch from their perspective, so they can't do all the things they would otherwise want to be able to do via make. All of these things sort of end up informing each other in some way, shape, or form, and so we're very much in that learning mode on all of these, right? And Q test is a slow burn in that respect, because I think we need to. I was about to use the word prerequisite, but that's perhaps a bit too strong, right? I think we could make progress on Q test without a large corpus of code, but would we feel more comfortable doing it with a large corpus of code? Absolutely, because it's then informed by effectively what's happening in real life. And what, as Daniel said earlier on, if we're using Unity then as the bar that has to be passed in order to know that we can do a release, then great, right? So that it sort of helps pull it all together.
Olivier has patiently waited with his hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Rudy suggested that we join today. I don't know exactly where to start. I've been silently using Q since now 2 months, and reading about it since quite a while. It's something that fitted very well the let's say the way we envision treating data. But since I started using it, I don't know exactly if I fit in the standard way of using a queue. Well, I don't know what exactly I should say. If you want me to, should I present a bit a use case that we do about the usage we have of queue? Or me, basically today I joined. I thought, yes, we are developing basically photorealistic 3D environments. I myself am a former consultant. It's 30 years that I run my company, and I'm building projects, ad hoc software for various institutions, individuals, and so on. And since the beginning of the year, I joined a startup because I really liked what they're doing. A small startup that is in Lausanne. It's called UzuFly, and the guys they operate and fly drones, make photos from the ground, assemble them with photogrammetry processes, and pop up with 3D tiles, with which they build 3D environments using either Unreal, the Unreal game engine, or Cesium. And the guys are specialized in GIS and have the ability to perfectly pixel align the 3D tiles with maps. And so starting from there, I joined them because I come from the world of data migration. Mostly, I've been doing a lot of digital publishing. And also later on data migration, where I've been using a lot of graph databases. And in 2014, I started some research on the ability to visualize graphs. And this led me to a very specific path, which was kind of the power of graphs to navigate in complex information sets. And when I met these guys in the end of last year, I thought, oh, damn, this is super interesting. GIS software, visualizations, and putting graphs on top of it to be able kind of collect data from any data source and then display it in a 3D environment. It's a very effective way to navigate complex sets of information. So on the beginning of the year, I joined them and we started to rebuild their digital platform because they have a simple app that they built in React in 2 sprints of 1 month, kind of heroic thing. And it's the thing that nowadays sustains the company. So they're selling this app from last year that was developed very quickly. And so we are now in the process of rebuilding this platform using other technology and with the ability to automate the process of releasing those worlds. And this is where kind of I had to give a hard thoughts about how we're going to do this, because one of this app has many specialties. It's not the standard client server app. It's basically a full front-end app that has a lot of backing services, but no backend. So let me explain. By backing services, I mean tile servers, or for instance, blob storage that delivers us the massive 3D tile sets. And the backing services are all the GIS servers that provide us with information about the territory. But there is no backend in the sense that we don't own any of this infrastructure. So it's not our backend servers. We don't have authentication. We have a little bit of storage. Yeah, I come to this. And so the problem is not having servers that we handle our own, building APIs that we handle our own, is we rely on backing services that are being handled by other people. And so we feed our system with data that they provide us with, where we have no idea if that schema might change at any time. And so this is where a queue fits in, because I thought, okay, in order to have a robust system here, I need to be able to test at the boundaries of our system whether or not the data comes in the right shape. And so this is very much in the philosophy of Rich Hickey, the language of the system. The idea is to put schemas at runtime around the boundaries of our system. So this was my initial idea of bringing Q in. And me, myself, I come from the world of functional programming. I've done a lot of Clojure. I've done a lot of XSLT and XML processing, so I'm very used to kind of these functional pipelines of where we transform data gradually and where we have schemas at every level. Voilà. So I covered Q. I was there kind of, whoa, wonderful. This is kind of XSLT, but a more evolved version. And I have a mix of schema and transformation language all at once. So I started with this insight, with these ideas. And I thought, okay, let's give a try to Q. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's just based on what you said, I think there's probably a number of areas there where you could leverage Q, and a number of folks who are already doing something similar to express relationships with external systems, and also as well abstracting away from how you're perhaps querying data or data is being fed to you as well. In terms of, if you sort of imagine in some situations data coming from SQL like data source or wherever it might be coming from, external, might even be streamed, whatever form it's arriving in. Q is also going to be a very good way of expressing that in such a way that you separate out, okay, the fetching of that data or how it's actually delivered to you entirely, but still be able to express the way in which you've queried the data or the way in which the data is being fed to you. So the schema being used to validate the data in some way, shape, or form. So I think there's a number of nice areas where Q could be used there. From the perspective of where Unity fits into this is interesting, in that I think it's probably more the modules side of things where, Rog, you might want to chip in at this point here from like a compatibility perspective. If you consider the external system on which you are depending as effectively owning the schema of data, and then them changing that schema in some way, shape, or form in a way that might be incompatible to your usage of it right now, or just changing it in some way, shape, or form, that actually does get quite close to where we ultimately will be exploring with Unity, is trying to understand, well, what sort of dependencies exist between things, and how if this change happens here, does it break anything? Because Daniel talked about it from the other perspective. If we change the Q language, does it break anybody? But you can hold it the other way around as well and say, if somebody changes this schema here, what does it break? And so yeah.
Point. Yeah. And we have a bit more expectations because these small companies, on this small company startup I'm working with, these guys, they kind of just deliver all the time. So we already currently have 40 apps that are out there in nature, and there are more 50 to come. And the main problem is currently these apps are copies of each other with changes in between. So there is no way I do release management with this. So as also the project manager of all of this, I said, this is not really manageable. So what I would like is that our app becomes function of configuration. That is, we're going to build one or more apps. So we're building actually a lot of components to be able to have different apps. And then for every customer, the whole app will be just a function of configuration. So the other part for where I see, where we use already Q usage, is to be able to express the schema of the configuration. And what I'm dreaming about, but I don't know yet how it works. But I'm pretty sure that later on, I will need, once we get a new version of the app, we're going to get a new version of the schema of the configuration. And I will need to map the 40 to 90 to 130 and so on existing configurations. And there I would like to use also Q. I'm sure I can do this, but I don't know how, but I'm pretty sure it's possible. So to migrate the existing schema from one version to the other. So there are two aspects there. The one is indeed establishing contracts with the outside world and be able to detect sudden changes on their side, because it's quite subtle. And there was also a question about the volume, and so just about the characteristic of the data. It's open data. The interesting thing is that it's open data. So we could perfectly well hand over our scripts. We could also hand over the data we're downloading. And the volumes are not enormous volumes. However, we're processing kind of 60 megabytes currently of JSON, where we do validation. This is extremely quick with Q. I was very happy to see this. And then we also do transformation of the data. And there I discovered that it depends, it varies widely, the performance. I haven't figured out yet what exactly impacts performance, but I saw that if I make slight changes in my pipeline of transformations, it suddenly performance goes skyrockets, and then it goes very fast. So basically, we validate data from external sources. I want to see it break if they change something on the backing services, and I have no contract. I have no hand. I will follow up. I will write the schemas. I won't ask the people I'm working with because they don't know Q. We're mostly working with the Swiss Office of Topography, Swiss Topo. They produce enormous amount of open data at extremely high quality. So we decided also to focus on this because Switzerland has kind of an edge there. It's amazing what they do. So we're using this open data, and for whatever we consume, I write the schemas. Then later on, I transform the schemas and I transform it in stages. So I apply one transformation, then I get the data in another shape, and then I apply a second transformation or third. And well, I try to have as little as possible. And then the third use case is for the configuration and migrate it later. And then to orchestrate this work, currently we're using Q on the command line. I have written all the scripts we use into simple npm scripts. So instead of a bash script, I simply have npm. I do npm run, and then I see all the scripts and I execute them one after the other. And there are a few tools there that enables to chain these commands. So it's very basic, very simple. And on the other side, Rudy is helping me also write a command line interface, because we will need to, there's not only the configuration, we also have to clone, produce, deploy, and so on, these various apps. So we're also writing a CLI, and we chose Go, because we saw that Q basically was written in Go. So the idea was that at some time we'll merge what I do currently on the command line and do everything in memory in Go. And maybe we can then reduce the number of steps I have. So voila, for an overview of what we do.
Sorry, Paul, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's fantastic. I think there's a lot of detail there that is probably worth picking up on, Olivier, in a later call, if you wanted to, just to understand, I think also from the compatibility perspective, because I think that's what you're going to end up leaning on quite a bit in terms of wanting to make sure you aren't broken or know when you are broken, also the data transformation story. So if you're happy, we can follow up afterwards. But it's very interesting, because I think it does actually end up quite a bit further down the line, touching on what we want Unity to also be capable of doing. But right now we're sort of in the earlier stages of Unity, but happy to pick up on all the aspects that you talked about in a separate conversation, if that's okay with you. That'd be wonderful.
There was also, I realize Olivier might need to step out for a second, but he also briefly mentioned we don't know if we're using Q the right way. And I want to say that because Q is a bit new in terms of configuration languages, there's not like a solidified set of principles and ways to use the CLI in the language. So I would say you're probably the same as everybody else. And I would encourage you to book a 1-hour video call with me, just so we can look at adding your project to Unity. And then we can spend pretty much the whole hour just talking about specifics about how you use it and how to test it. And I'm going to be more than happy to help you through that. Aside from that, I realize we've got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to give a moment to see if anybody else has any more questions before we run into time. Roger, did you want to follow up on anything about this particular project from Olivier, or was it a new question?
I will, but let's let Juan do his thing first.
Juan, please go ahead. You've been patiently waiting.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, my question is because if I recall correctly, in the list of features from Unity test, it's mentioned that some kind of support for those tests or for those that Go code that uses the Q Go API is marked as coming soon. So I was curious about what kind of. I mean, it's maybe a bit out of the scope of this call, but
No, it's exactly in scope. It's one of the things I've been worrying about recently. Basically, the way Unity works right now when testing a project is that we run a set of commands and we check some property of how they behave. Like, do they succeed or fail? Or is this output exactly matching this expected output? Things like that. We did have to insert a bit of special treatment for Go, because, for example, if Marcel has a set of patches that are about to change how comprehensions work in Q, for example, if we want to test that behavior with your Go tests, it's not simply installing a newer version of the Q CLI, right? We also need to change the Q version in your Go mod. So that was basically what the issue that you're referring to was about. It was about teach Unity to essentially swap out the Q version that is in your Go module as a Go dependency, right? So that does already work today. If you were looking at the issue tracker in the public repo that's about to be archived, I would say that's probably out of date at this point, just because things have evolved quite a lot. But the swapping of the Q version in your Go mod does work. So right now, if you have a Go project that uses Q as a dependency, we are able to use Go test, Go run, Go build, any command that does a Go module build, and we will swap out the Q version. That does work today.
Okay, nice. Yeah, thank you. Because in our case, precisely, we are using Q, but at the end, the external surface of the application is basically in Go form. So as you can imagine, you have way more unit tests written in Go that use the Go API underlying than like pure Q tests.
So do you mostly use the Q CLI or Go API? Or both?
For unit tests, we use mostly the Go CLI because we have Go unit tests.
Okay, gotcha.
Because they call the public surface of the framework, and it's the Go code that then use the Q code internally.
Yeah, I would say that should be fairly easy to add to Unity and test that way if you want. It would be a matter of either booking time with me or sending me a DM and or installing the app at the same time if you want, or after. But it should be fairly straightforward. Famous last words maybe, but hopefully it should be pretty easy to add.
Okay, yeah, I'll try. Thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in about just talking to you, Olivier, about the previous, what we were talking about, which is super interesting. And a big part for me of what's interesting is I've been working on the module support in Q, and a significant part of that is deciding about compatibility and that sort of thing. And you're talking a lot about schemas and compatibility, and so it's like really really interesting I'd be interested to talk with you at some point about what your expectations might be for that, because individual use cases are like super helpful to inform design. So perhaps we could have a chat at some point about that sort of thing.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm fully available. Yeah.
And you might also be interested to come along to the modules call tomorrow. Same, or actually now later tomorrow, I think it is. You have a moment.
Okay. Any more questions or ideas or anything else to bring up? Otherwise, we might finish 10 minutes early. That is the discussion for tomorrow's modules call, right? Yes. And as a reminder, if you go to the discussions under the announcements category and find the Unity announcements thread, which I can link to again here, you have all the contact information there as well, if anybody wants to follow up on Unity. Thank you. That's the one, 2427. Cool. So thank you all. And I'll give you all 8 minutes back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Bye.
Goodbye.
Ouais. Il y a quelqu'un? Oui, je t'entends. Pour se voir, il faut peut-être enclencher le caméra. Hein? Oui. Alors, qu'est-ce que tu en penses? Ça va bien, non? Ouais. Ouais. Comme... Mhm.
En même temps, c'est dans un repository qui
Mhm.
Et puis, quel est le outcome? Je les ai pas vous avez exécuté.
Ben, il semble que, justement, il faut discuter cas par cas, comme j'ai compris. Donc, ouais, comme il l'a dit, on peut passer 1 heure, toi surtout, puis mon compagnon avec Daniel, ça serait bien. Ouais, donc, moi j'ai l'impression, donc, ouais, il faut, je pense, un premier mode de fonction de test serait pour moi de utiliser soit ton npm script ou équivalent dans Makefile ou autre, bash script c'est égal, whatever works, pour justement exécuter le script, le schéma, les évaluations, les validations, les transformations, pour l'exécuter. Et je dirais, il faudrait fournir des données qu'on télécharge une fois pour le besoin de test, puis il reste stable. Et ensuite, qu'il vérifie s'il y a des changements de queue, que ça se passe toujours bien. Là, il parle quelque part de golden files, disons. J'imagine, pour moi, j'imagine ça serait, j'imagine ça comme ça, fournir le schéma d'un côté, le fichier que nous téléchargeons comme sample, comme échantillon, en dériver le résultat, et tout ça devient un set, un test case où il rejoue nos scripts avec nos schémas sur les mêmes data pour chercher le même résultat. Golden, je pense que c'est ça, avec le résultat. Non, le nouveau résultat se compare avec les anciens. Puis si ça décale, c'est qu'il y a un problème au milieu, dans le cube. Ça, c'est une chose. D'autre part, ce que nous intéresse beaucoup, c'est la future intégration, laquelle je dois encore découvrir et créer. Donc, exécution des schémas à l'intérieur de notre application, en appliquant le QCLI. D'abord, ça n'existe pas encore. Et une fois que j'existera, ce sera l'autre chose, l'autre chose à tester. Là, on pourrait de nouveau imaginer peut-être une version de l'application qui, de nouveau, au lieu d'aller chercher des données sur le web, de fournir les données fixes, puis il travaille sur les données fixes, mais en passant par CLI. Autrement dit, émuler le fetch par un fetch local et ensuite vérifier que les résultats locaux sont stables. En exécutant le futur CLI avec le Q qui, lui, va évoluer. Ça serait très à long terme, disons, pas d'ici 2-3 mois, j'espère, ou 4. Je sais pas, ça a un sens ce que je dis?
Je pense que ce qui est intéressant, c'est que ce qui est important, c'est que très intéressant avec c'est borderline.
Oui, parce que je pense ne cherche pas à se limiter d'emblée. C'est plutôt il crée quelque chose qui est capable, qui est fort. Donc, ouais, disons, ouais. Ouais. Non, pas du tout, au contraire. Hein, Des futurs développements. Ouais, parce que comment à savoir comment faire, puis comment à savoir. Enfin, tu sais.
Mais je ne sais pas exactement, est-ce que je mets chacun des textes, à chaque fois, je mets un objet et puis je mets le texte en tapant, ou est-ce qu'à l'intérieur de l'objet, le système approche en éveillant une fois 100% de données avec des boutons, est-ce que je factorise, je sors ce qui est dépendant de la langue, une section avec un bundle, ce qui est dépendant. Tu vois, il y a ce genre de questions qui ont différents impacts. Donc aujourd'hui, on a des problèmes qui sont là.
Ouais, c'est plus de comprendre qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire, ou disons, à quoi aboutir.
C'est là d'écrire tout ça dans le pied, c'est que ça nous permet aussi de mettre des descriptions. C'est quand même
Non.
l'avantage, c'est que tu sais,
Ouais. Ah, c'est chaque fois.
On a la piste. Donc, ce que je m'applique, c'est que c'est stabilise. Alors, le schéma, je fais tout le temps. Mais ça va être la façon. C'est plutôt dans le vieux, comme toute la maîtresse, et tout. C'est pas fou. Première version, je vais puis après, graduellement, je vais partir. Parce que je vais raffiner les scripts, donc à un moment donné, c'est comme ça que c'est finalement intérêt capitalisé. Pour l'instant, c'est très modeste. Quelques schémas.
Ouais, le processus aussi. Ok.
Mais la raison pour laquelle c'est vraiment ça dans Go, c'est que je pense qu'une fois qu'on sera dans Go, ce sera beaucoup plus facile de faire le pipeline. Parce que là, c'est très facile. C'est le PM, ça fait des scripts en temps réel, c'est plus longtemps, écrire le script, le lire. Et puis, en fait, j'écris des schémas, je peux repartir hier, et quasi ça simplement. Si c'est plus compact, plus simple.
Bon, moi, j'ai encore plus fait. Non, ça m'intéresse au maximum, mais je fais du minimum parce qu'il fallait chaque fois avancer l'application, ce qui est aussi hautement intéressant pour moi. Et surtout, il faut livrer pour que ça marche. Donc, chaque fois, je m'empresse de, disons, avancer à la prochaine étape.